Hey everyone, today we're diving into the interesting history of Dacian warfare. Now, if you're not familiar with the Dacians, they were a mix of tribes living in what we now know as the Balkans, from around the 10th century BC all the way up to the 2nd century AD. Their homeland, called Dacia by ancient historians, was home to Thracian, Ionian, and Dorian tribes. These guys were constantly involved in battles, both with neighboring tribes and among themselves. Now let's talk tribal wars. The Dacians didn't always get along with each other. They often fought amongst themselves, but there was one man who changed all that, Burebista. He united the Dacian tribes into a powerful empire. But, like many stories from history, things didn't last. After Burebista's death in 44 BC, the unity crumbled, and Dacia was thrown into chaos with civil wars. Burebista's once mighty empire was split into 5 different kingdoms, which made it much harder for the Dacians to defend themselves against their enemies, especially Rome. Fast forward to Decebalus, another Dacian leader who managed to pull the tribes together once more. Decebalus wasn't just any leader. He scored some impressive victories against the Roman Emperor Domitian, proving that the Dacians were a force to be reckoned with. Speaking of Rome, let's jump to Domitian's Dacian War. In 86 AD, Emperor Domitian launched 2 campaigns to try and stop Dacian raids across the border. The first expedition, a total disaster. The second one ended in peace, but Romans weren't exactly happy about it. Many saw it as a humiliating defeat. Then came the big show, Trajan's Dacian Wars. In 101 AD, and again in 105 AD, Emperor Trajan led 2 massive campaigns into Dacia. Trajan wasn't messing around. He sent in 13 Roman legions and managed to turn Dacia into a client state after the first war. By the second campaign, Dacia was fully taken over and became a Roman province. Rome controlled it for about 150 years, ruling the entire Transylvanian region. But the Dacians' time in the Roman Empire didn't last forever. Eventually, migrating groups like the Visigoths, Huns, and Slavs swept through, cutting Dacia off from the Roman and Byzantine empires by the end of the 6th century. Now, let's talk about how the Dacians fought. They didn't have a permanent army like the Romans. Instead, they'd raise fighters when needed, mostly after harvest season, since most of the men were farmers. Their gear, pretty basic. Most Dacians fought in their everyday clothes, using just a shield for protection. Only the wealthy and noble class could afford armor and helmets. There were 2 main groups, the Comitai or long-haired people, and the Paleti, the cap-wearing people, who were the local chieftains leading the charge. And now let's dive a little deeper into the Dacian military and their tactics. The Dacians had developed into a highly militarized society, especially during the times when they were united under one king, like Burebista or Decebalus. Between 82 BC and 106 AD, they were a major threat to Rome's provinces along the lower Danube. In fact, Julius Caesar himself had even planned to go to war with King Burebista to prevent an invasion of Macedonia. But fate had other plans, and both rulers died in the same year, which threw Dacia into disarray. Their once powerful army, which could muster up to 200,000 soldiers, was reduced to just 40,000. Still, the Dacians were not to be underestimated. Even after their internal conflicts weakened them, they kept launching raids across the Danube. In 10 BC, Marcus Vinicius managed to repel one such raid, but it didn't stop there. By 85 AD, the Dacians were almost on the verge of defeating the Romans in Moesia, and they even managed to kill the Roman governor, Appius Sabinus. The Dacian Warriors, now led by Decebalus, were a force to be reckoned with. They annihilated the army of Cornelius Fuscus, though later they met defeat at the hands of Titius Julianus at the Battle of Tapi. Still, the Romans struggled to maintain control, and Domitian had to settle for a humiliating peace agreement with Decebalus. But that was far from the end. Emperor Trajan later waged 2 campaigns against Decebalus. The first ended with a temporary peace, but in the second, the Romans conquered Dacia in 106 AD, taking about a third of its territory and reportedly capturing around 500,000 people, according to ancient sources. Even though Dacia became a Roman province, it didn't mean peace for the region. Free Dacians continued to launch raids, teaming up with Scythians and Germanic tribes, keeping pressure on the Romans. Now let's talk about how these warriors fought. The Dacians had a very distinctive approach to battle. They often charged into battle after the eerie sound of the cornix, a type of war trumpet. Their standard bearers carried a Draco, a dragon-shaped standard that must have looked pretty terrifying on the battlefield. But their real power lay in their weapon of choice, the falx. This curved, sickle-like weapon came in two forms, a shorter one-handed version, called a sika, and a much longer two-handed version that could slice through armor with devastating effect. However, using a two-handed weapon left the warriors without a shield, making them vulnerable. The falx was so effective against the Romans that they had to modify their armor to protect themselves. They reinforced their helmets with iron bands and started using extra armor for their legs and arms, which was a rare change for the Roman army. The Dacians weren't just about brute force either. They were masters of surprise attacks and strategic retreats, often using their fortified strongholds in the Carpathian Mountains to their advantage. These fortresses, known as davas, were built in layers, allowing the Dacians to fall back to the next line of defense if the outer fortifications were breached. One famous example of their clever tactics was during the wars with Rome when Decebalus nearly defeated the Roman garrisons in the winter of 101 to 102 AD by launching a surprise attack over the frozen Danube. Trajan himself had to step in with the main army to prevent a major defeat. By 106 AD, however, the Dacians were cornered in their capital, Sarmizegetusa, and their final resistance crumbled when the Romans cut off their water supply. On the battlefield, the Dacians wore different types of armor, depending on their status. Wealthier Dacians and nobles could afford more elaborate gear, like Phrygian-type helmets with intricate designs, and some even wore armor made of iron scales. Most Dacian warriors, however, fought without armor, relying on their skill with weapons like the falx, spears and axes, and using only a shield for defense. Cavalry units were fewer in number and often relied on their Sarmatian allies for mounted combat. The Dacians weren't known for being mercenaries like some of their neighbors, but a few did serve in Greek and Roman armies from time to time. Their nobility, though, was a different story. A Dacian chieftain in the 2nd century would have looked impressive, wearing bronze helmets and iron scale armor, wielding a sword, and carrying a large shield with ornate designs. Their strongholds were built to withstand even the might of the Roman legions. These stone fortifications, especially those surrounding Sarmizegetusa, were nearly impenetrable. In fact, the Romans had to bring their famous testudo formation to break through the Dacian defenses. The Dacian military had some external influences too. They incorporated ideas from Greek fortification strategies, while also using the Draco as a military standard, a tradition that likely had its roots in ancient Asia Minor. Their ranks were also bolstered by allies like the Sarmatians, although not all neighboring tribes were friendly. The Celts, for example, were easily defeated by the Dacians, and the Scorchi, a Celtic tribe, were among those conquered. After the Roman conquest, Dacia became a Roman province until 271 AD. The Romans didn't take any chances. Young Dacian men were either killed, enslaved, or recruited into the Roman legions. The Dacian population was expelled, and their lands were handed over to colonists. Rome even minted a special coin, the dacicus, to commemorate the conquest. Although the Dacians were eventually subdued, they left an impression on history. Even the Romans, who often described them as barbarians, spoke of them with a sense of respect. Emperor Trajan himself referred to the Dacians as noble, though dangerous foes. The ancient Greeks also had a certain admiration for Burebista, recognizing the power and influence he wielded over his people.